Hello everybody, welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. Now you may be seeing two of me because there's me and then there's me right over that way. But today we're going to be talking about my run this weekend when I went and played Vivi to a 4-2 record to win a very a reasonably small local tournament. But I mostly wanted to talk about this because Vivi has been one of my passion projects over the past couple months, and it's a deck that I really love. I am literally, you can see I have literally the Izzet symbol tattooed on me. I am a giant Izzet stan, and so for me, I was really excited to rep Vivi yet again in the CEDH metagame and talk about the big modifications that I made in my different iterations of Vivi. So, fun fact, I have played Vivi 3 times in 3 different events. The first time was release weekend, where I won the entire tournament up in Massachusetts for their 2K. The second time, I brought it out to Minnesota for one of their larger tournament out there. And unfortunately, I went, I think, 1-3, and things did not go pretty well for me, and I definitely got a bad meta read. And there were things that were making the deck a little clunkier than I was hoping for. And then this weekend, I was able to go 4 wins, 2 losses, and a 4-round top 10 cut. Started out 0-2, won my last 2 rounds of Swiss to make top 10, and then proceeded to win both my semifinals and finals matches with Vivi. So I'm super excited to talk about the deck and a lot of the modifications that I've made between each version of the deck list, and talk about all of that with you here today. Before we jump into everything, make sure to hit that like button if you like content like this. Hit that subscribe button if you want to keep watching more videos here on the channel. And if you hit that little bell icon, it'll let you know every time we drop videos here on Comedian MTG. If you're interested in supporting us, check out patreon.com/comedianmtg. I'll talk a little bit about CEDH coaching later in the episode, but if you're interested in that, you can reach out to me in a number of different places like comedianmtg@gmail.com or any of the places in the link tree down below. Without further ado, let's talk about our little pingin' guy. So, this version of the deck is called the Tiny Ping King 3 What If Cringe. And for the for any context on this, you probably want to originally get a little bit of a read on Vivi itself. For those who have been living under a Final Fantasy-based rock, this is Vivi Ornitier. I believe is how you pronounce it. It is 1 and Izzet for a 0/3, and it has an ability for a 0. You can add X mana in any combination of colors of blue and or red, where X is its power, and you can activate only during your turn and only once each turn. Then whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a 1/1 counter on Vivi and deals 1 damage to each opponent. So the main conceit with Vivi is that you are playing a bunch of non-creature spells, you're getting a bunch of power on Vivi, you're using its ability to make a bunch of mana, but specifically you are abusing its relationship with curiosity style effects. Now, Ian, what is a curiosity style effect? Curiosity style effect is one of these cards, based off of, guess what, the card Curiosity. Curiosity says, enchant creature. Whenever enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. And you'll notice it does not say combat damage, it says deals damage. So every time you are casting a non-creature spell, not only are you buffing your commander, giving yourself access to more mana, but you're also able to deal 1 damage to each opponent. And with every curiosity effect in this deck, you are able to, per non-creature spell, draw 3 cards as long as you have 3 remaining opponents in the game. Now, some of you may have already seen my journeys with Vivi so far, or may have experienced Vivi out in the wild in general. And so you may be going to yourself, yes, Ian, I'm already aware of how Vivi works, and Vivi is a quirky little guy, but let's jump over to EDH Top 16 and talk about how Vivi has been doing as a deck. And the answer is not that great, to be honest. It's been a really popular deck list. If you go over the Commanders tab on EDH Top 16, it actually makes the, top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So it is the 14th most popular deck over the past 6 months, which is a really impressive as far as popularity is concerned. And yet, we go back to the stats where you're looking at, it really only has a 16.3% conversion rate in that time period, right? In events of 60 plus players, right? So the deck has been doing all right, but the best result we have here in 60 plus players for the entire year is a 3rd place result. Now, these events are filtering out, obviously, some of these smaller events. As I mentioned, I was able to win 2 events with this deck so far, but these are smaller events. So the original event I won, I believe, had something like 50 players. So if we go down here, yeah, the 56 players was that one. So literally just misses the filter by 4 places. And then If we have to go even smaller, you'll see the one I just attended this weekend, which was, as I mentioned, only 28 players. And yet there still can be a lot of games learned, or a lot of lessons learned, because guess what? We still played 4 rounds of Swiss and still had a cup to top 10. So yes, smaller tournament. Yes, I still am excited to talk about the things that worked in the deck list. So this is version 1, the one that I was able to win my first event with Vivi. And as many people jokingly referred to this deck, they called it Bad Ral, right? Which I think obviously was a very dramatic way of interpreting it, but I definitely think there was some truth to that, right? A lot of Vivi in this initial variation was using things that you find in a lot of the Ral Monsoon Mage Storm decks, right? It's very classic Is It Storm style cards, right? Using things like Past in Flames, you're doing intuition piles, all that kind of stuff, and you are using a lot of red rituals and things like that, and you're going and trying to just cast as many spells as possible, get as many triggers on Vivi as possible, and go from there, right? And while that version of the deck worked for a short amount of time, it only worked for a short amount of time. People started to catch on to the gimmick of Vivi, and especially if the deck didn't have any resiliency towards those mid-range games, the deck really didn't have game in those spaces. And so despite the first iteration feeling pretty decent, as I mentioned, I was able to win the entire thing with it, I still felt like it was very flawed, right? It went 3 wins, 3 draws to take down the entire tournament, because that was also a top 10 cut event, right? And I ended the Swiss in second place, I believe, during that run. And so first weekend of the new set, it felt pretty decent, but it definitely felt like there were flaws to it. So when I took it to the Minnesota event, I made a few small changes. And let's run a little comparison page between the two lists now. So between version 1 and version 2, I didn't change too many things. It was only about a 6 card shift, which is definitely going to be very different than what we see between versions 2 and versions 3. So I took out Dizzy Spell, which, spoiler alert, I actually did put back in for version 3. I took out Bonus Round because I did find Bonus Round to be a little bit win more. Took out Time Twister because, you know, it was okay. Took out Ral itself, Embrace the Unknown. And one of the flaws of taking out some of these red creatures was that I was leaning heavily into the Storm package and then proceeded to take out cards that rewarded the Storm package. I also found that in that version, the deck was very fragile. If someone killed Vivi, I legitimately had a game at that Minnesota tournament where someone killed Vivi, and it wasn't until 5 turns later did I get enough mana sources to be able to cast it the second time. And to me, that immediately was a giant red flag that, like, there is something wrong here. And one of the things I did add that I was actually pretty proud of between version 1 and 2 was Wild Slash. Wild Slash is a really cool spell. It is a 2 damage to a creature or player. I believe it's been errata to any target if you look at the errata text. Yeah. And if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, which Vivi very often is because of all of its triggers, damage cannot be prevented this turn. So this is kind of our way of getting through the one ring if we are trying to Curiosity Storm very frequently. Even if, hypothetically speaking, all of your opponents had 1 ring protection, you can always Wild Slash yourself or one of your own creatures or one of your opponent's creatures. And then all of your VV triggers are starting to get through and actually deal damage to your opponent. So Wild Slash was a very fun little pickup for the deck and something I was very excited about between versions 1 and 2. Also, I basically highlighted how good Intuition was in version 1 and then Gifts and Given went into version 2 as well. Born Upon a Wind came in. My thought process there was, in the original version, I was like, well, Vivi is unable to be activated on my opponent's turn, so why would I need Born Upon a Wind? And I basically just added it in because I was like, hey, like, it worst case scenario, this is a 2-mana spell that draws a card and then puts another counter on Vivi. Realistically, it isn't that big of a deck building concession. Impulse, a little more card draw. Swan Song, a little bit more interaction, which, boy, between version 2 and 3, are you going to see a little bit more interaction, and Gut Shot there to not only deal with Bowmasters, but also just to be another free VV trigger without spending any mana to get that, which comes up all the time in this deck. I cannot tell you how many times having a card like Gut Shot comes up in this deck. Now, it's very funny also, sometimes they're you know, you're trying to deal with a creature with 2 toughness and you just show your opponent a Gut Shot and you're like, I can't really help out here. But, you know, that's not really why we're playing Gut Shot. So a number of these changes stayed in my current iteration, except for Gifts Ungiven, which you're going to see in a second here. Now, notably, the original version of this deck list was very, very greedy. You can look at the Counterspell suite and notice, I believe, even in the version 1, I actually didn't even have Force of Will in here, right? But you'll notice no Bind Break Trap, no Force of Negation, no other free counterspells, right? You have things like Daze and you have Pact, and you have a couple things here and there, right? But in the first version, I wasn't even on Swan Song like you see in the second. So the first version of this deck was very much a very greedy, proactive Izzet Storm deck. Now let's compare all of these things to the version I brought this last weekend to the tournament, version 3.0, also known as Vivi, the Tiny King Ping 3.0, What If Cringe. Do you want to be using the best deck boxes in the game? Do you want to be using the best high quality playmats in the game? Well, check out Heavy Play. HeavyPlay.com/comedian can get you 10% off your order. Heavy Play has been working with the channel for quite some time, and I legitimately love working with Heavy Play because I use their products all the time. Not only do they have amazing deck boxes, dice trays, and more, but even more recently, they've come out with a new print run of their sleeves, which I always thought had the best shuffle feel of any sleeves I was used to, but used to have problems with splitting, and now they don't do that anymore. And I've actually had people go out of their way to talk to me about the fact that their sleeves are also not splitting. I had a client talk to me earlier about having 75 games with the new sleeves, and none of them split at all. So they fixed the issue with the sleeves. The deck boxes are nauseatingly awesome. I'm super happy with all of my Heavy Play products, and you can get yours today by going to heavyplay.com/comedian and getting 10% off your order. They have a lot of really cool stuff out right now. They've got new colors for their sleeves. They've got their amazing, not only foldable mats that make traveling with your CEDH collection so much more convenient, but they also have so many other options, including the playmat carrier, the deck box carrier, the brand new tubes, all that stuff. Check it out, heavyplay.com/comedian for your order now. Now, what could I possibly mean by what if cringe? Now, there's been sort of a meme that has come out in the format recently, which is basically this mentality of, okay, you just play a mid-range deck, you lock up with a Heuristic Study or another card draw effect, and whatever your commander is should be able to embellish that game plan a little bit. And my thought process was, okay, clearly the all-in Storm variant of Vivi just is not as effective as I would like it to be, and it's a lot more inconsistent than I am comfortable with. So the what if cringe is more realistically a reference to what if I take this deck into a much more responsible mid-range direction. Now, the cringe aspect is a reference to the fact that we are playing things like, for example, Mirror Maid to potentially copy other people's Heuristic Studies and stuff like that. Also tested new potential Spice Piece Psychic Possession, which I think is actually decent, but I don't know if it's necessarily decent in this deck specifically. I found having the double blue in the corner was a little bit more problematic for this deck than I was expecting it to be, but it's definitely a card I want to keep messing around with. Maybe if not in this deck, in other decks, especially I think in like Kinnan decks, this card's pretty interesting as well. Shout out to a couple pilots, Panda and Pajamas especially, for putting me onto this one. It was pretty sweet tech here. But yeah, let's do a little comparison page, and you'll start to see a lot of these major differences between Tiny King Ping, or Tiny Ping King. Oh my God, how many times have I been saying that wrong? Tiny Ping King 1, 2, and 3. So we saw the difference between 1 and 2. Let's look at the difference between 2 and 3. So in comparison, this is a 16 card difference between version 2.0 and version 3.0. And these 16 cards, I think, tell a very deep story. Whereas we have basically said, hey, Red, listen, it's been fun and all, but maybe we've been, leaning on you a little too hard, right? So we've cut out the intuition piles in the deck. No more Past in Flames. We took out the Gifts Ungiven as well, obviously basically being the same sort of inclination here. Now, I do think that there is a world in which, even though we are lower on rituals and things like that, we do potentially think about things like Gifts and Intuition for future versions of the deck. But in the meantime, I found that to be a little tougher. I did feel like I missed Desperate and Pyretic Ritual a decent amount, and those might make it back in just because they're mana efficient enough to potentially be worth it. But the rest of it I do feel really, really good about, which is basically the removal of a lot of the impulse draw in the deck. What I basically found was that while I was trying to basically build up a momentum of Storm and things like that in the deck and give it a certain level of consistency when it came to instants and sorceries, these were all just cards that decks like Ral were better at playing, right? And so I found myself asking, like, am I playing Vivi the best way I can play Vivi, or am I trying to shove a generic Izzet mentality onto Vivi? And so what I did instead was say, okay, well, let's see if Vivi can hang in the mid-range game more efficiently than it could hang in a more Storm sense. So first thing you'll notice is, as I mentioned, I added a few more card draw engines, things like Psychic Possession. But I also added back Dizzy Spell. I felt much better in a slower version of the deck that also cared more about blue spells. And Dizzy Spell did end up performing in multiple games. So I do think Dizzy Spell is much more appropriate in this version of the deck. But the other thing you might notice in this version is, boy, did I add a lot more interaction. I am on Misdirection. I am on Mind Break Trap. And I am on, where's that Commandeer? I'm on Commandeer as well. One of my lands became Sink into Stupor. And you'll also notice that here we only have one land, one MDFC showing, right? Whereas I proceeded to go up one MDFC, two MDFC, 3 lands. So I replaced one MDFC and then added 2 more lands, which gave the deck a lot more consistency. And especially in the situation that I was sort of alluding to earlier where, hey, first attempt with Vivi didn't go quite as well and Vivi died. What do I do here? And, we found ourselves a solution for sure. So a few more interactive pieces. Hullbreaker Horror was a last minute add. I've always kind of believed that you don't necessarily need Hullbreaker Horror in Vivi, and I'm still in that camp. But what was nice was having this sort of security, because with Vivi in general, a lot of the sort of conversation around the deck is like, oh, well, you just kind of outlet with Underworld Breach and like that ends up becoming your main win condition with the deck. And while I agree to some capacity, I do think it's nice to, for example, if something happens to your Underworld Breach, like it gets Force of Negation or Mind Break Trapped and it gets exiled forever, I don't want that to just be the end of my hard wins. Now, a lot of my wins in this tournament did come from manual VV pinging, right? I was able to basically go through my deck enough without essentially like getting to a Hullbreaker or even to a Breach, but instead was just able to manually cast enough spells to genuinely burn my opponents out, right? There was a couple games where I stuck a Curiosity on Vivi and I just got to the point where I cast 20 spells. And it wasn't even necessarily that I was demonstrating any sort of deterministic loop or anything like that. I just put 20 spells in the stack and kind of went from there. And that was able to be pretty successful. So definitely a good note. And to me as a deck builder, that's a very positive sign for the deck. So not only do we have 3 more pieces of free interaction in the deck list, I also added Counterbalance. Now, Counterbalance might seem a little odd here, and to explain Counterbalance a little bit more, we've got to go back a couple years. So if we look back at around 2022, what we were seeing was Counterbalance was actually a piece that was being played more in Turbo Adnaz decks than it was in Control decks. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would they be doing that, right? And the sort of idea was, if the curve of your deck matched close enough to the average curve of a CEDH deck, then mathematically speaking, Counterbalance should be active very often. And what we were finding in that time period was that Counterbalance acted as sort of a defense grid. Not only could you play it very proactively early in the game and maybe throw off your opponents by flipping Counterbalance at the right time and countering, maybe, for example, I had during my semifinals, I stuck a Counterbalance, flipped over a 2-drop during the, I believe, second turn cycle of the game, countered a 2-drop from one of my opponents, and proceeded to have each and every player just pass because they could not cast what they were planning on casting that turn because it was a 2-drop in the developmental phase of the game, right? So not only did it disrupt my opponents in that way, but Counterbalance can also sort of act like a defense grid style effect, right? If you are going off during your turn, especially with a deck like Vivi, where you're constantly, especially if you have like a Curiosity, for example, resetting the top of your library because you're drawing a bunch of cards, your opponents have to choose and interact at the right times. And if you're casting spells and drawing cards, you get to reset the top of your library and continually flip through Counterbalance that way. So it ended up being pretty decent. And also, Sensei's Divining Top was already a card I was really heavily thinking about in the more blue version of this deck list. And so basically culminating on this idea that I have the 2 of these cards working in tandem nowadays, I was like, great, this is exactly what I want them to be doing. So I'm feeling super ecstatic about it. And to be honest, they overperformed. As I mentioned, like being able to take your opponents on turn 2 of a semifinals match and say, I just time walked the whole table because each and every person had a 2-drop that they wanted to cast and they could not do so, was absolutely huge. Now, Counterbalance is a card that has its high highs and it has its low lows. There are going to be times where it shuts off basically nothing. There's going to be times when your opponents are presenting threats and you flip over a land and they're like, cool, great, I don't care. I think also worth noting, if you haven't played with Counterbalance before, you don't have to flip it, right? I want to say that again. You do not have to flip your Counterbalance. So for example, even if you don't know the top card of your library, and you're going into a turn cycle where you're worried that your opponents are probably going to start trying to win the game, if they lead off by playing something like an Elvish Mystic, you don't have to flip on that. If they start by playing a Lotus Petal, you don't have to flip on that. And there are going to be times where, a couple spells down the line, they play a really important 2-drop and you flip and it's a land and it could have countered that Lotus Petal, right? But more importantly, it kept your opponents guessing and it kept them off balance. And Counterbalance, I really think the mastery of this card is knowing which spells are important enough to be flipping on. Not to mention, obviously, if you have effects like Brainstorm and Sensei's Divining Top, it obviously makes it a lot better. I did add Brainstorm to this version of the deck list, and Brainstorm was not a card I was playing. Actually, I haven't played Brainstorm in CEDH in like 3 or 4 years. It's something I'm actually pretty low on in general. But the fact that it's a cheap instant speed spell that can put a counter on Vivi and can get us a little bit of card selection at the very least, and it's not like you don't play any fetch lands. With all of those things in mind, I was okay with Brainstorm. It performed decently enough. I can't be too offended by it, but I'm definitely like, eh. It's like if you told me we have a better card to replace it with tomorrow, I'd be like, you're out of here, right? But it was fine. It was fine. Magic Damper. I like this card a lot. I've kind of wanted to find space for it in multiple iterations of this deck. You give your creature +1/+1 in hexproof. So if you put it on your Vivi, especially if it's earlier in the turn cycle before you play something like a Curiosity or a Tandem Lookout or an Ophidian Eye, it can actually be pretty effective. And one of the reasons you play Magic Damper over, for example, like a Dispel or another counterspell, right, is that Magic Damper, first of all, untaps. So sometimes you'll have something like a Paradise Mantle or a Springleaf Drum, and it comes into play there. That's the most minimal of all effects right there. But specifically, because it's granting a thing hexproof and it's not trying to counter something, if your opponent is using something, for example, like Odawara, like a channel ability or a Colossal Sky Turtle or some sort of maybe touch the Spirit Realm in the same capacity to maybe take out your Vivi, having Magic Damper giving Vivi hexproof and also giving it an extra power for the turn, right? So it triggers Vivi, triggers its ability, gives it an extra power for the turn, gives it +1/+1, and gives it hexproof for the turn cycle. I used this spell as a ritual during multiple points in the game, just as a 1 mana give Vivi +2, right? Meaning the Vivi trigger and the +1/+1. And then had situations where I would give it the pump a little early in the game just to use it as a ritual. But then if I found another piece, I was able to go, cool, well, Vivi's hexproof at this point. I had a game where I had to jam into a Mystic Remora, and that did come up too, where I Magic Dampered early. They didn't have the counter spell, but by the time they drew a removal spell later in the turn off of the Mystic Remora, they were like, well, Vivi's hexproof at this point. I can't do anything about this, right? So that ended up coming into play a few times, and so far I'm pretty happy with Magic Damper. I definitely am, in this new version of the deck, more open than in previous versions to cards like Wild Ride and a few of those pump spells. And last but not least, I want to talk about Savor the Moment. Savor the Moment is one that's been in my I am so close to playing this card, but don't have the space for it for a while with this deck. It's a take an extra turn, but you skip the untap step, and you might be going like, well, why would you want to do that? If you have Vivi and you're able to go, cool, take an extra turn using Vivi's ability, and then go into my next turn, get a refresh on Vivi's ability, you're able to draw another card, go into all that kind of stuff. Vivi's ability gets refreshed. It can come up and can be pretty effective. I did find that the double blue cost up in the casting cost of the spell did come up somewhat negatively a couple times during the course of the tournament, but in general, it's a card I still want a little bit of time with, but it and Psychic Possession are definitely the two of the most flexible spots in the deck right now. And if I had to make swaps, those are two of the ones that I'd probably go towards cutting first. Last two cards to talk about, Cyclonic Rift. Just a good card in general. We're already on Displacement Wave in the deck, so I wasn't necessarily sure we needed Cyclonic Rift 2. It didn't necessarily come up a whole ton, but I definitely had one game where I was basically trying to have a conversation and be like, hey, can I get to my turn with Vivi so I can activate and put a Cyclonic Rift in the stack? It didn't work, but it was a good conversation to have. And obviously another single target bounce spell is never necessarily a bad thing to have access to. So that's one of the more flexible pieces as well. Urza's Bauble. The 0 drops are really good with Vivi. You can play Vivi and then play a 0. Now Vivi has 2 more power. You can activate its ability. You can start churning spells together. So there's a lot of cute stuff you can do with the bauble style effects. They're not the most broken things in the entire world, but they give you extra power for your commander, and sometimes you just need those, and especially when you have things like Displacement Wave, able to pick your rocks back up and have that go off over and over again. By the time you start getting Curiosity style effects, these having zeros is very helpful for the deck. So very, very happy with a lot of the modifications I made. And then these are the cards that we said we're cutting as the Intuition Gifts pile, and then just a whole bunch of red rituals and red impulse draw effects. And I didn't miss them. As I mentioned, Pyretic and Desperate are the ones that I'm at least like considering putting back, just because they're really good at like just getting the momentum going. I did in the finals fizzle for the first time when I went into a combo with a Curiosity style effect and like 2 or 3 mana. Usually the deck almost never fizzles in that position, and that did come up with this newer version of the deck, which doesn't make sense, right? So if we're on this version of the deck that is less utilizing less ritual style effects, it makes sense that the ability for the deck to fizzle when it's like comboing off is higher, right? Like not having Desperate, Pyretic, Seething Song, and potentially Ruby Medallion to reduce the cost of some of these spells definitely made that more likely to happen. And so that is definitely something of note, that this version of the deck can potentially fizzle a little bit easier. But I did play the deck all day and only fizzled a single time on my combo turn, so I'm not too worried about it. But it is something I'm keeping in the back of my head, noticing whether that's something that's going to be coming up more and more. As the deck potentially can play a little bit more of a mid-range game and a little bit more of a fast game in different capacities, right? So this is Tiny Ping King Theory, What If Cringe. And I like the deck a lot. Vivi is a commander that I have no problem admitting, like, I'm kind of obsessed with. I think this little guy is awesome. I don't know that necessarily it's like a tier 1 option in the format, but it definitely feels like a tier 1.5, tier 2 option if played correctly. It's just a little bit hard to like get all the numbers right. Like I think at some point that you might want to consider like an Essence Flux style card to potentially reset Vivi in the middle of your storm turn, so you're able to like flicker Vivi and then get that ability activated again. But at the same time, if you do that, then you have to flicker Vivi, which means your Curiosity effects might fall off of Vivi. It's kind of a whole thing. And so I think that there is definitely a lot of interesting conversation to be had about this deck. I think there's still a lot of creative design space for deck builders to like get Vivi right. And I definitely feel much, 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 much better about this version of the deck. I think we are far past the point where people are like, oh my God, Vivi's Nadu too. It's not even close to that. It literally doesn't even have card advantage attached to the commander. But I think it's a solid option. And honestly, I feel more like that I'm validating the fact that Vivi is a contender nowadays and not validating the fact that Vivi's not the best deck in the format, right? Feels much more like I'm saying like, no, I promise this deck's real, and less of like the, no, I promise it's not busted, right? Like it's much more the case where I feel like I'm validating this deck's existence. But I like it, and it's cool, and it's really nice to have an is it option that feels like at the very least, if it's not one of the top decks, it can at least hang with the top decks. And I think that's all you can really ask for when you're looking at some of these low color options, is like, do they get to hang at a CEDH pod where people are playing good CEDH with high power cards, right? ToaMagic.com has one of the largest inventories of Magic singles that you may have access to. They have insanely fast shipping, and they can get you 5% off your order with code Comedian at checkout. Toa Magic is an amazing store. They have such a crazy inventory. They have insanely quick shipping. So if you need cards, they can get them to you fast, as well as they have pickup at a number of their tournaments that they attend. So if you go to their website and see what events they're going to be attending, especially things like MagicCon coming up, if you want to pick up some singles and have them available at the Toa Magic booth while you order them online, you can use code Comedian, get 5% off your order, and then go and pick them up at location, or just have them shipped to you, as mentioned, in a super quick and convenient way. So ToaMagic.com gets you a crazy inventory of singles, and once again, use code Comedian to get a percentage off your order. Of note, we can check out the sideboard a little bit to talk about some cards that are potentially considerable in the deck as of right now. Some of these are obviously just the modifications from the other version of the deck. Filter Out's one that I'm thinking about quite a lot for this deck. Basically says return all non-creature, non-lands to their owner's hand. So it returns basically every enchantment, every artifact, every planeswalker, etc. To its owner's hands, which I do think, that being an instant, there's times where this deck is really tough. Like you have to very, very, very succinctly and cohesively plan how to play around Ristics and Mystics, right? Like when you're doing the manual Curiosity Storm stuff, playing into those cards can be really, really dangerous, right? And so filter out is a really nice way to go like, all right, cool, before my turn, I'm going to filter out, bounce all the Mystics, Ristics, etc., bounce all my own mana rocks. I got my Vivi hanging out, and now we're going to go into my turn, and I'm just going to go, cool, mana rock, mana rock, mana rock, mana rock, Vivi, 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 Vivi. Hopefully win the game at that point as well. The other card I'm considering for this very same purpose is actually Narset Parter Veils, which is another one that I feel like I haven't talked about in 7 million years. But it says each opponent can't draw more than one card each turn. So it's a lot easier to go off into a bunch of Mystics and Ristics if they get one card as opposed to a million cards. And you don't want to basically jump into the giant counterspell fight expecting to be able to win that when everyone's drawing like 3 or 4 cards for every iteration that you're going through. So Narset's one that I'm thinking about quite heavily for this exact reason. The idea of basically being able to go, all right, cool, I'm about to try and win on my turn, or even just like I'm trying to keep the crazy decks in check, right? Like there's a lot of One Rings and Ristic Studies and Timnachroms and all of those cards running around the format, and so like just playing an Narset and blocking attackers from hitting it with Vivi, I think is a very real thing to be doing. Especially if people are concerned that Ristic Mystic's a very detrimental thing in the format. Maybe Narset's something worth considering. Obviously, 1 blue is a big investment. That's the toughest part about it, but it's a card that you can still invest into while also progressing your own game plan forward and keeping some of the crazier decks in check with that ability as well. Drift is an interesting one. It can get you Heuristic, it can get you your Curiosity cards, or Ophidian Eye and Tandem Lookout specifically, so that's pretty sweet. The rest of the stuff here, I know Artist Talent's one I wanted to test, but I literally just don't own a physical copy of this card, so like I keep going to think about putting it in the deck, and then it's like the night before the tournament, and I'm like, oh wait, I don't own that card. As I mentioned, I'm sort of thinking about some of these pump spells a little bit more. Wild Ride is one that I'm constantly told by other VV pilots that is worth exploring, and I don't doubt that at all. I just haven't had a chance to do so. In a version of the deck where I felt like I wanted this effect and had space to have it. I caught Mystical Tutor for Hullbreaker Horror. I did not regret it. Mystical Tutor was significantly worse without Intuition and Gifts Ungiven in the deck. Basically just trying to find other bounce effects if I'm doing that. So felt like a card I could afford to lose maybe a little bit. Some people might notice like some notable exclusions from the deck. Force Negation's not in there because this deck is not trying to be an instant speed police deck, and the other free spells that we have can also be played on our turn as well as our opponent's turn, and we still have a ton of free interaction, right? Like if there's 30 instants in this deck, I'm not too worried about having answers for our opponent's stuff, right? So we're doing okay as far as that part's concerned. We're only on 5 creatures, right? Like the deck is very, very responsible if you want it to be, right? Like I had a couple games during the course of the tournament where instead of doing the Vivi thing, I just like stuck an early Ristic Mystic and just played a responsible, like, is it mid-range plan? And that was like most of the point of why I made the modifications to the deck, is that I want to be able to do the Vivi thing, right? I had a game during the Swiss where I tried to win on turn 2 on the play, and I got my Curiosity Mental Misstep, but I still was able to put up a turn 2 win in the same breath that I was able to have a game in which I stuck a Ristic and then a turn later played a Vivi and killed up some counter spells, and then a turn after that I used Mirror Maid to copy my own Ristic study and did that, right? So the deck is definitely capable of dynamic gameplay, which I'm very excited about. And it was kind of the whole reason of this newest modification of the deck list. So it feels pretty good as of right now. Feeling very happy with this current iteration of the deck, and feeling, very proud of the work that's gone into it so far, because it feels like it's paying off to a degree. Last little thing we'll do here in this deck tech is do some mulligans, kind of show you the thought process behind some of the hands that we're keeping with the deck, all that kind of stuff. And if you're curious on going even deeper into this archetype and talking about some of the subtleties of piloting it, what are your good matchups, bad matchups, all that kind of stuff, I do offer coaching over here at Comedian MTG. So if you're interested in that, reach out to me at my email, comedianmtg@gmail.com, or any of the places in the link tree down below. My normal pitch is that I have more wins with diverse decks than any other player in CEDH, and probably one of the most continuous grinders in the format. Has been one of the top players in the world for several years now. So if you're interested in getting that coaching, hit me up at any of those places I mentioned, comedianmtg@gmail.com, or any of the places in the link tree down below. Let's jump into those mulls though. So I think one of the things that folks think about when they see Commandeer as a card in the format is they talk about, oh, can you keep Commandeer hands, right? Keep hands based on the fact that you are just trying to steal an advantage engine off of Commandeer. And I find those play patterns to be a trap more often than not. So you are going to find me not keeping hands like this that are basically just, hey, I have some like just the most flood in the world. And a Seagate Restoration and a Commandeer is definitely not nearly enough. Traditionally, when I'm looking at mulligans, I'll start in first seat, move on to second seat, third seat, fourth seat, etc. So going from there. This hand is a bit of a risky one, but it's probably worth keeping. The idea here is that we have the ability to potentially get a turn 2 Rhystic Study down. So we're probably going to play our fetch land turn 1. We're going to gamble for a Soul Ring. And if we pitch the Rhystic Study, we are probably going to cry. Yep. But from there, that's our game plan. If we hit the Soul Ring, fantastic. And if we pitch it away, that's sad. And if we pitch away the Rhystic, we're traumatized deeply. But on a first 7, I think it's good enough. Plus, worst case scenario, you do pitch the Rhystic. You still have the ability to play Vivi kind of early, get a little mana rock down. You have Light Up the Stage, which is one of the more interesting, like smaller card draw cards in the format in the deck. So there's still some gameplay to be had here for sure. All right, first 7 of seat 2. For some reason, I think it's reading this as a green screen. Anyway, so this is a no-lander, so we're not going to keep a no-lander anyway. All right, this one's kind of interesting. So we don't have any colored mana sources outside of this talisman. It's a little awkward because Daze is a dead card because we don't have any islands in the hand right now. And this hand's still pretty decent if we are able to hit another land drop. Now, the math is not super in our favor because we only have 26 remaining lands in the deck. But between that, the fast mana, between the fact that Mishra's Bauble is basically a cantrip at some point, I feel like I'm still pretty much willing to risk this hand because even if we draw like a colorless source, we have that 1 ring able to come down pretty quickly. This hand's definitely more towards the greedy side of things, but I think if we were in like 4th seat, I maybe wouldn't be willing to take the risk as much, but being in 1st or 2nd seat, I think we're in 2nd seat officially at this point, I think I'm willing to take a risk on it and, just deal with the fact that, we might whiff on it. That's okay. But the 1 ring's a big factor in why I'm keeping this hand because it's going to allow me to play my game plan pretty early on, If and the 1 ring is definitely a card I'm still feeling really good about. I know a lot of people have been cutting it lately, but to be honest, it's won me almost every game it's resolved in, and I'm pretty okay with those numbers. Okay, first 7 of seat 3. This hand has 2 lands and a Mox Opal and nothing else. There's nothing that advances our game plan. There's no tutors. There's no curiosities. There's no win conditions. Bye-bye. All right. This is our second 7 of seat 3. We have a little bit of awkwardness in the sense that we have a Mox Opal that won't be turned on until we get the 1 ring down. But that being said, this hand explodes out pretty quickly. Ironically, I do think that there's a world where we actually exile the Mox Opal here because Virtue of Courage, for those who haven't seen this, is a curiosity effect. It's one of the more interesting ones because it's very expensive at 5 mana, but I don't necessarily know that I want to go exiling one of our curiosity effects as a pregame action. Now, you could exile one of your lands and sort of basically pray that you hit a land by turn 2, but as I mentioned, only 27 lands in the deck, so there's only 24 remaining if we go and take that action right now. And while Mox Opal is nice to have access to here, it's not actually like saving us in any capacity. The difference between playing the 1 ring on turn 2 and then playing the 1 ring and then having Mox Opal up is not 0, but it's not a lot. That being said, Virtue of Courage is one of the most expensive curiosity effects, so I don't think it's the most offensive thing in the world if you do exile it. And the more we talk about this hand, the more I'm kind of inclined to do so. But for some context, I'm talking about exiling Virtue of Courage, getting this gemstone down, playing this as our land for turn, going into the Arcane Signet. Obviously, we'd go fetch a Volcanic Island or something. Then next turn, we have access with this 3rd land to then go get the 1 ring down. And then we have our Mox Opal as well. And finally, we're going to find a hand for 4th seat. And in 4th seat, we're going to need a lot more action because we got to catch up for the rest of the table. So a hand like this that has a card advantage engine that's not going to come online for quite some time is a little bit rough. This is also one of the reasons I'm a little concerned about Psychic Possession in this deck. It feels like there's a lot of times where I'm not getting it until turn 3 or turn 4, which is very slow for it. Second, 7 here is a no-lander. So, yeah, no, not happening. 6. Okay, at 6 here, I noticed in the past people have a bad habit of looking at Gitaxian Probe in an opening hand and being like, well, it could be anything. It's an extra draw. That's a very losing mentality, in my opinion, and you're more often than not just going to draw a dead card in these situations. We don't even have a red source here at this 6, so I'm more likely than not just going to ship it away and go to a 5. By more likely than not, I mean I'm never keeping this hand. Okay, at 5 here, this 5 is also pretty rough, right? We have our Breach with no payoff for Breach. We have 2 effects that take an extra turn. We do have our Curiosity effect in Virtue of Courage, but it is, as I mentioned, the most expensive Curiosity effect in the deck, and so I'm very hesitant to keep a hand around it when we are looking at 2 lands as our only source of ramp. So yeah, we're at 5. Yes, going to 4 sucks a lot, but I think keeping this hand would be way worse than almost every 4 in our deck. So let's go see if that's true. Looking at 4 cards here, this is also still a little bit awkward. You might be saying, oh, well, Ian, what are you talking about? You have the ability to get Vivi down on turn 2. And then what is the question here, unfortunately, because you are able to have a bunch of lands and you have Breach in hand, which is not a good card in hand. It's a card that's great when you have the rest of the pieces of the combo. You have Force of Will, which is effectively a dead card, and you have Chromox, right? So there's nothing to put on Vivi. There's no way to draw cards. Once again, very scary and dangerous, but I'm going to 3 here, absolutely every time. 3's a no-lander. Ouch. All right, at 2 cards here, we're just going to take the most efficient thing we can take, and at this point, it's just take an island, take a Curiosity effect, and sort of hope things break better. But at the same time, I don't feel bad about passing up on any of those hands because all the other hands there were completely unplayable. Yeah, it sucks sometimes mulling to 3, mulling to 2 cards, and it feels really bad. But the odds of that happening are significantly lower than a lot of other things happening in the deck. So at the end of the day, yeah, sometimes mulliganing aggressively can be a very dangerous predicament. At the same time, though, I guarantee 90% of the other hands we looked at wouldn't have played Magic either, right? So instead, I'm going to risk going down pretty low and looking at some of those tougher hands. And that, my friends, is our deck tech here on the Tiny Ping King 3 What If Cringe, my newest rendition of Vivi Ornitier, and this deck that I truly am in love with. I think Vivi is such a fun commander. I really enjoy the fact that I've been able to work on so many different versions of this deck so far, and it's definitely a deck that I am not going to be putting down. It's a really cool commander. As I said, as an Izzet player for a really long time, I've really wanted an Izzet commander that speaks to me, and I've had some that have been fun in the past, but when I basically took them out for a spin, they really didn't do a whole lot, and I've had other stuff that I played before, where like I've enjoyed Malcolm Kedis and things like that in the past, but none of them have really spoken in the way to me the way that Vivi has, and I've really enjoyed getting to work on and play with this deck. What do you all think in the audience? Do you think you would play a version closer to the faster Vivi lists out there? I think there's so many different capabilities for a lot of these Vivi lists. I know people play a bunch of different stuff, things like Quicksilver, Elemental, stuff like that. So there's a lot of really cool stuff out there for Vivi. This is a list I am starting to fall more and more in love with, and it's something really, really fun to work on. So it's been really fun. Curious to hear all your thoughts in the comments down below. And without any further ado, I will catch you all next time. Peace.